may mean more than one thing or different things at different times. This is one of the themes in the talk that follows, built upon long-standing fieldwork in the state of Gujarat in India. Prefacing fieldwork from 2000 to 2006 with Sindhi-speaking Hindu women who migrated from Sindh to India during the partition of the Indian subcontinent in 1947. It moves to a fieldwork-related narratives from 2008 to 2013 by Sindhi-speaking Muslim and Dalit women in a border region called Bani, situated at the Indo-Pak boundary near northern Kutch, Gujarat. The observations stem from efforts to listen, understand, and contextualize narratives, an act of translation, but not without the linguistic process of moving from a marginal language such as Sindhi to English. The discussion also hopes to complicate the idea of access in fieldwork, which assumes two extreme positions of possession and non-possession. Access granted is not the same as access guaranteed, so that women may have better access to other women than men and yet not enough. This also brings us back to the half-revealed, half-hidden part of stories. When the province of Sindh went in its entirety to Pakistan in 1947, the Hindu minority that constituted approximately 25% of its population began crossing the newly formed border to live in the independent new Indian Republic. The move was not complete in the sense that a trickle of Hindu Sindhis continued to move in smaller groups even today. However, the bulk of Sindhi Hindus migrated to India between 1947 and 1950. Partition is a heterogeneous discourse mediated by caste, class, gender, and of course personal experience. A range of contexts mediated not only the process of migration, but also the resettlement and the shaping of the partition memory. In interviews conducted with a generation that had vivid memories of the partition, women from urban and rural, rich and poor families formed a part. It was found that through women's narratives, we learn more about the patriarchal and feudal aspects of Sindh than the historical and political events of partition. This is not to say that women do not have a sense of history, but that they were not involved, as I said earlier, in the nitty-gritty of logistical details. They have participated in Hindustan, Pakistan, without very often knowing the month and year. Their narrative does not provide the details of leaving and traveling which become central to the men's experience. Women were not the ones deciding or implementing decisions. Very significantly, women did not see themselves as individuals undergoing the partition experience. They would frequently make use of the plural of the pronoun we, you know, saying, हाँ हम कह रहे थे, हमने तो हमको कहा गया कि यहाँ जाना है, हमने ये किया. It was very interesting. The men would say I, the women would say we in their narratives, showing an intertwining of individual lives and collective lives. However, partition did impinge on women's individual lives in very serious and irrevocable ways, on which much research has been done. Meanwhile, the complete erasure, denial, and recuperation of memory and the mediation of class observed during fieldwork with urban Sindhis has left me with the confidence of being able to talk with Sindhi women elsewhere. Whether the conversations about partition with women had provided me with complete truth was not the question, but by being member of a witness generation of the so-called same community, the conversations had certainly inspired its own certainties and comfort. Therefore, while turning to another phase of fieldwork, this time with Sindhi-speaking rural women in a remote part of India, have seen the part of the same continuum of sorts. The account below unveils the erroneous assumption that sharing the same language and gender lends to complete possibilities of translation. In the extreme west of India, where North Kutch touches the border of Pakistan in a region called Bani, which is very often missing from the maps, situated in a corner of the hyper-industrialized state known for its aggressive nationalist politics, Bani is quite an oddity. People entirely were Muslims, save small sections of Dalits and another underprivileged group called Vadha. Bani has no upper caste Hindus. Since 2011, one of its villages has emerged as a site for an annual desert festival, extended fieldwork in Bani, carried out over 5 to 6 years, and focusing upon its pastoral communities, sense of self and community, shifting ideologies of religion, and responses to forms of regional and global changes, constituted the crux of my research. The discussion draws from that larger study, hence this talk is called Memories and Movements, because this is the book that it led to. I call this section Ideologies of Invisibilizing. It is absolutely possible to go to Bani and not see any of its women. Secluded in and confined to their homes, women go out rarely and almost always accompanied by men. Meeting women there can happen only in two ways. Either they come out of the house and you happen to see them as passers-by or in shops, buying or selling things. The second possibility is that men take you home to meet the women of the family. Both possibilities shrink in the face of a general norm in the entire region by which women are simply expected to stay away from any contact with strangers, especially men, and very often women too. Therefore, visitors are made to sit in an otak, an exclusively male domain, in the form of the first bunga. A bunga is like a conical shaped mud baked house, which you will find all over Kutch. As you enter, and then a community-based neighborhood in that region is called Wand. So each patriarch has its own Wand. उसका अपना कबीला होता है. So you say Isa Bhai ni Wand, which means Isa Bhai का पूरा जो कबीला है. Tea or meals are served in the otak, and the ones serving are the younger men of the family. So you will not see women, right? They are not serving you. On very rare occasions, a woman visitor may be allowed to go behind the otak, accompanied and watched by the men. The title of this essay, Beyond the Otak, invokes the spatial authority of the otak, the male or main room in the Bani household, which was to be traversed to reach the women in the interior part of the Wand. The narratives that emerge out of those spaces are extremely complex, hinting at simultaneous processes of continuities and discontinuities, submission to ideologies of male control, accompanied by a desire for change. In his travels to Sindh in the 19th century, author B. Cranton Carey discovered that there was reluctance among pastoralist men in rural Sindh to admit to another man that women could read and write. He says every girl in Sindh, except among the least educated classes, learned to read the Quran and also the Noor Nama, a book describing the Prophet and the saints, written in ancient Sindhi by Abul Hasan of Thatta, but this without learning to write. Writing is still considered a dangerous accomplishment for women. And even today, Bani is very much like that. The three contexts of Sindh, pastoralism and Islam, in the sociology that Brenton Carey refers to, is also the sociology of Bani, notwithstanding the century dividing the two. It is not being suggested that there is a seamless continuity from one to the other, but to draw attention to studies that document the role of Sindh as a society that sustained for centuries structures of patriarchy, a matter far from peculiar to Sindh alone. In her research on Sindhis in Jakarta, Hong Kong and Manila, Anita Thappan notes that among women of the Sindhi diaspora, attempts to transgress gender roles are few because Sindhi women have internalized the patriarchal system predominant in Sindh and they tend to conform to its norms. The women who form Thappan's assessment are the well-heeled upper-class Hindu women whose families spread themselves far and wide as part of a long-standing global mercantile network amongst the Sindhi Hindus. Physically away from a traditional and feudal Sindh, cushioned with economic privilege and social opportunities of meeting other cultures, they represent one end of a spectrum. Muslims, rural, poor, isolated from other societies and discourses, and confined to their homes, the women of Bani represent another end of the spectrum. Somewhere between the two are urban, middle, and upper-class Hindu Sindhi women who, as I discussed elsewhere, find the gender norms in their community unjust and constricting, leading them in many cases to a degree of disaffection with all things Sindhi. So one of the experiences would be young women whom I would interview, and this was my own story as well. If I told them that, you If someone says you don't look like a Sindhi, what do you feel? She would say, I'm very happy, Professor. I've also discussed the social economy of Sindh that may have contributed to severe gender inequalities, which continue to be perpetuated even today, despite many outward signs of affluence and vernacular westernization. Having said that, it is the complex web formed through demography, religion, class, and patriarchy that makes Bunni's women invisible, and that needs to be delineated and underlined. Zaida Mutwa, name changed, lives in the village of Gorewali. She's one among 40 members of what is called Musa Jivand, right? I mentioned to you what, or Musa's enclave. Musa Mutwa is her father, the patriarch of the family. His wife, 3 children and parents, his younger brother and his wife with their 3 children live together. Between them, they share a kitchen and 3 bungas. However, a small threshold divides this entire group from the family that Isa's wife hails from, which again forms a large unit of 20 members with sons and daughters, brothers and their wives, and their children, adding up to what looks like a clan of people when you visit Musa's house. It's easy to lose sight of Zaida. When I first met her, she was a 12-year-old girl studying in grade 6. The school is right next to our house, she told me. I do padai and bhanai there. And padai is Quran ki padai. Bhanai is the formal study, which they had to do in Gujarati, and which is they couldn't relate to Gujarati at all. So they would do study the Quran. उसकी तफसील सिंधी में होती थी, which is why they were comfortable. So she said, I do padai and bhanai there, thereby referring to the fact that her Quranic education as well as school education took place in the same compound. She had learned some Sindhi, some Arabic, and a smattering of Urdu and Gujarati. How much are you going to study? I had asked her when she was 12. I had my answer on my last visit. Zaida had turned 15, quit school, and was about to get married. She would continue to live in the same ward, except move one house away, since she would be marrying someone from amongst the same clan and house next door. This is exactly what her mother and grandmother did. The indistinguishability of one generation of women from another in Bani manifests in few outward ways, such as clothing. Zaida would wear synthetic frocks and shalwars because she said this is fashion in Pakistan. The older women wear embroidered kanjri. Kanjri is, I don't know whether you saw in that photo of fully embroidered, yeah. The older women wear kanjri and heavy silver jewelry. In terms of education and marriages and even possibilities of physical movement outside the home, the difference is marginal, if not non-existent. In a population of over 15,000 in the region of Bani, only one girl in its entire history has studied up to standard 10. A local newspaper found this newsworthy, and I was proudly shown the clipping by the girl's father, considered to be perhaps the most progressive man in Bani. Is she likely to study further? I had asked, to which I was told, no, there are no higher education schools in Bani and no lady teacher to teach, so it's out of question. Although it is difficult to say where patriarchal rationalization begins with what is understood as Sindh and ends or tapers into the idea of Islam, the rhetoric is worth examination. For instance, Hashim Halepota, back from his travels to Mirpur Khas in Sindh, says, we see culture in its purest form in Sindh. The same hospitality, the same Sufi music and poetry, and everyday life. What about women, I ask? There is no difference in the way women live here and there. It is part of Sindhi culture to safeguard women's honor. To maintain this sameness, as is the case with many other things, a part of what we discuss as Asli Shafkat, it helps Bani reinforce its connection with Sindh. The implication is that Bani is derivation of that original and it needs to approximate Sindh as much as possible. It is in that understanding of Sindhi Shafkat or Tehzeeb that women in Bani follow specific norms of behavior. Deviation from such norms have not been heard of, and if differences do exist in the way women live, they have largely to do with class. Intertwined with this ideology is also the vocabulary, which again is derived from Asli Shafqat. The practice of women secluded is among Sindhi Muslims is that women cannot be allowed gairat. It is explained as the need to keep women away from outsiderness, the gaze or the proximity of an outsider, and also make them abstain from things that would pollute their purity and respectability. The twin terms employed to suggest this is through two interrelated terms, gairat and parhez. The noun gairat has a Perso-Arabic origin and it's more common to use it is as in the adjective gair, meaning someone else or not your own. To commit gairat is to have contact with an outsider, a situation perceived as an unreligious one. The word parez, they'll say, sanjo parez hi kutumba. You know, कि हम ये परहेज रखते हैं. We don't meet people there. And so on. I'll skip a few sections because it'll take too much time. So this, I look at terms, the Sindhi words, that in that particular region manage to sustain an idea of respectability, purity, and an idea of borders. And I think one of my arguments has also been, what are the different borders in this border region? Right? ये ओताक से अंदर जाना भी वो एक border है. कितने तरह की Delhis है. So there is the Delhis of the international boundary, and you will find the border security force there. Then you also have the Delhis by which what is considered to be Ashraf and non-Ashraf vocabulary has been made into a certain kind of a boundary. This region has a very big tradition of Sufi thought and ideology. You know, Nishat earlier mentioned that I'm translating Shah Abdul Latif poetry in his bed from Sindhi to Hindi. Shah Abdul Latif वहाँ की पूरी जो region है, गरीब से गरीब, in fact खास तौर से गरीब, everybody would know him. Like he is a part of people's, memory all the time. And it is very interesting that over the past few years, there has been an attempt to kind of purify the region of these Sufi influences, right? And therefore talk more about a slightly more Ashraf and so on. So एक अहले हदीस की जो influence से कुछ border making जो हो रहा है इस region में, उसके बारे में भी I talk a lot, but I don't want to do it today because it's probably not relevant to us right now. Tak, right? Going to the women, and it's quite interesting when I was given an entry into that part of the house, and all the women of the ward, the young, the middle, the older, they would all come to see me, right? And all of them, 20, 30 women, would suddenly come around me, and they had a lot to say about many things. So they would say, "Kuch baaton ko nahi pata." Like there was such scorn because I wasn't wearing any. Then of course there was so much judgment because I left my daughter and I'm here hanging out with men and doing this research. And then at some point my husband would sometimes come on that. So then they were very happy that okay they are. And I think my husband is, I think he deserves it, but I think he's one of the rare men who was brought quite close actually to the women's quarters by Isa Bhai. But Isa Bhai would announce his arrival and the fact that there's someone there by doing what we call khonkaru. He'll call. So then the women would all turn with their backs there, and Isa Bhai said, okay, yeah, over here are the, So it took quite a while, and I want to and some of the women here are some of the finest embroiders in the world. They have received awards from presidents and so on for embroidery. Right? I call this section Asanke Khaso Na Lage. This is a very touchy Sindhi way of speaking, and I want to talk a little bit about this. Nazneen, again name changed, had worn a synthetic green frock and shalwar. Introducing her to me proudly as the newlywed bride, her mother-in-law said, "Look at her, isn't she pretty?" A host of women waited to see my reaction and verdict. The moment Musa leaves me in the women's quarters, a privilege I acquired after we had known each other for some time, and after he had visited me in my house in Ahmedabad, his wife, his brother's wife, nieces, daughters, daughters-in-law, all came to that bunda. The room gets filled with all kinds of conversations that do not find completion because someone or the other is constantly saying something or offering tea, because, and asking the usual question, "Diya ke na bati aayi hai?" Har dafe akil hoti achhi. Or the older Fufi, Musa's aunt, who would disapprovingly remark, "Khasa kapda pae bain na, icha patu tai." Very good clothes, they would tell me, because there's no embroidery of the kind they had. Nazneen watched with amusement. She was indeed a radiant, newly-wed young woman with large earrings and henna on her hands. "So which village are you from, Nazneen?" "Fulai," she replied. While she married into one family, another girl from the same family was married to Nazneen's brother, thereby keeping up the endogamous tradition of exchange, or what is called in Kutch, Bado Bharana. Nazneen had embroidered her wedding quilt and brought her clothes in a tiny bag that lay in the corner of a bunga. Using that as an excuse, she had brought me to her bunga. She wanted me to see her books in the bag. She held out a collection of stories and anecdotes about the life of Vatayo Fakir, a popular folk figure from Sindh. She asked me if I had pictures of my house or my daughter. "Have you traveled to Ahmedabad?" She laughed. "Not in Bhuj. I have been getting headaches, so I will now be able to go and see a doctor in Bhuj." This was clearly her only legitimate reason for going out. I was to find out during my next visit that her mother-in-law had stopped allowing her to make continuous visits to the doctor. "It's only a headache. Our women don't go out and meet other men. We are after all a Paresi family. Once she's pregnant, everything will be fine." Nazneen is only a year older than the 15-year-old Zaida. So this goes on. I get introduced to somebody who has been awarded by the president for her embroidery and so on. And I asked her that, she said, so I asked her, when did the award take place? She said, I was taken to Delhi. And so I said, where did you stay in Delhi? So she said, yaad ko na kuch lodhi. She couldn't remember. So I said I asked her in Sindhi, I said, so when you were there, did you go to other places? And she said to me, and this is something I've never forgotten, which is why I think so much of actually understanding gender is about understanding language. It is about unraveling language. She said, "Asa ke khaso na lage." Asa is hum. Asa ke khaso na lage. Khaso is अच्छा. हमको इसका दो मतलब होते हैं. हमको अच्छा नहीं लगता, हम पे अच्छा नहीं लगता. ये दोनों मतलब इस चीज के. She said, ऐसा के खास होने लगी. This idea of like, हम वहाँ किसी चीज के लिए गए, फिर हम घूमने ऐसे टहलने चले जाएं, कुछ और देखाएं, हमको ये अच्छा नहीं लगता या हम पे ये सुहाता नहीं है. And I left it at that. I think this ambiguity, the fact that I don't understand which of the two meanings it is, I think is a good thing. Because why I think field work should not be about smoothening and about translating and about making it fully legible to us because it makes life easy for me. If I come away from that field never knowing for sure whether Asanke Khaso Nalage meant to be agential or whether it meant to be something else, I think just as well. Because what kind of hubris is it for a field researcher to go away thinking, I've got it all. You understand? Yeah, that I can interpret it. And that is where I think my being a translator is deployed for me as an important ethic of fieldwork, as an important question in fieldwork. And this is not only in relation to gender. For instance, there is another community, very tiny, called Vada. And for the longest time, I would not be able to figure out कि वाडा जिसको बोलते हैं कि इसका ये होते कौन है. In the sense, लोगों के जो ये भूंगे हैं, उनमें जो लकड़ी का काम किया होता, like lacquer work, रंग बिरंगी lacquer work किया होता. In Sindhi, we would say for a carpenter, we would say vadua. But I wasn't sure whether they are Hindus or Muslims, whether they are scheduled caste, scheduled tribe. At some point, I asked myself this question, that why do I want to find out? Where am I going with this? Because it is the most disenfranchised community. And when I would go to their house, there would be someone called Salman, and there would be another brother called Bodhabai. And I did not know. So I asked one of the Vadas, I said, Tata, again, Allah Hindu jiran, ke Musalman jiran. So, who are you? And he said to me, he said, yeah, I know it is very bad. He said, yeah, very kharab gana. And he said, एक तरफ होती है ना कुछ, हमको हमको एक तरफा होना चाहिए था. And I felt so ashamed of myself when he said that. He said, "आप just, people, educated people like you, you're right. हमको एक तरफा होना चाहिए." And I'm thinking, we talk about post-colonial hybridity and celebrate, if you like, and when we are actually encountering it, we are not comfortable, right? Which means we want hybridity of a certain kind. We don't want hybridity of all kinds. And so it's a separate chapter in the book. But I think what I'm trying to say is that even there the question was whether a field worker aligns with the dominant categories of the state and translates experience. Whether this act of translation, which aims to make everything smooth, is one of the big challenges of field work. And I think the idea that सब कुछ मेरे बस की बात नहीं है कि मैं हर चीज का मैं तर्जुमा कर सकूं. To know कि मैं नहीं कर पाऊंगी हर चीज का is a good lesson to take away from. And so this particular question असांखे खासो न लगे, or even the example of the Vada stayed with me. I want to come now to what I call beyond the otak, embroidery, agency and exploitation, and I will not have probably too much time, but one of the arguments that I actually make is that when I say that women are invisible to us, I think I turn around at some point in this chapter and ask this question whether we are invisible to them, and whether whose need is it. So one of the ways I think to understand gender in this region and to realize that women are noticing is actually to see that through the embroidery. So anything facile by which we think that there is no distinction between Zaida Mutwa's life and her grandmother's life will take a toss if we were to see the embroidery. क्योंकि Zaida की embroidery में आपको कहीं पे computer भी दिखेगा, right? So then I began to again ask myself this question because I am constantly a student of language. I began to ask myself this question that for me change, what are the signposts of change? As to when do I think that change has occurred? And I think we are socialized into thinking that there has to be only these signposts of change. So अगर धागों में फर्क आता है through generation, एक नस्ल से दूसरी नस्ल तक, तो वो भी तो एक चेंज है, कुछ हुआ है. If you उनकी एम्ब्रॉयडरी की तस्वुर में if you are able to see कि कुछ अलग डिजाइन आए हैं, कहीं तो कुछ हुआ है, कुछ पता चला है, कहीं से कुछ कहानी आई है, कुछ लोगों ने देखा है, right? So although the girls were not allowed to see any films, and I have a chapter called bypassing television. टीवी नहीं होती लोगों के घरों में, ओताक में होती है, where the men are, और उस पे चद्दर लगी होती है, right? And so the women are not watching it. So I asked someone else, Sabeha, I said, Shahrukh Khan में नहीं देखा. So she said, nah. Now I don't know whether she actually hadn't seen it or not. But I began to think that, but their embroidery is showing that something is, some new images are happening. There is a new design. And I thought maybe my understanding of change and movement needs to sort of account for the fact that there are more sides than the ones as urban women we are kind of socialized into. So I will simply come to the, how are we doing with time? You're so polite.
It's very engaging, so you can continue.
Okay. Yeah. Embroidery in Bunny is passed down from generation to generation. In the afternoons when women are done with a series of chores, cooking, which is usually on firewood, cleaning, drawing milk out of the cattle, giving the cattle fodder, they huddle over their respective quilts and kanjaris. Sometimes they embroider on the same cloth, 2 or 3 people approaching the fabric from different ends. Those are also the moments when they tell stories, share jokes, teach and advise the young, relay stories about men's short-temperedness, or intermittently break for namaz. What gets produced out of these gendered interactions, away from most eyes except the ones belonging to the family, is what is hailed as bunny embroidery, an authentic emblem and mark of the region. It is characterized by a pattern density and an integration of ground and surfaces. Bunny women share preferences for 7 colors, satrangi, color combinations, motifs, designs, scales, and materials that reflect their shared landscape and economies, as well as an Islam inspired aesthetic that not only proscribes representational motifs but encourages a densely patterned surface. The networks of memories, words, threads, and identities woven into this interaction are perhaps inscribed in the embroidery, evident in a little stitch that a younger woman may wish to do differently from the older woman. However, in the ultimate and eventual tapestry, little differences get subsumed by a familiar, albeit exquisitely characteristic look of bunny embroidery. I suggest that this is symptomatic of yet another paradox we encounter in bunny. Embroidery, argues Judy Frater, is a direct written expression of the experience of the impact of cultural and historical influences and an understanding at a deeper level of the actual processes of change. Based on the embroidery produced by the Rabari women, Judy Frater traces the historical changes of this originally camel breeding pastoral nomadic group over Western India. Patterns of movement as well as sedentarization, distinction from and assimilation into other contact groups get inscribed into their embroidery, making it a rich textualities of community histories. It tells the story of women's lives, their dowries, adolescence, marriages, youth, and widowhood, registering life stages as well as larger stories of borders between nations. Embroidery also tells the story of the pastoralists of Bali as also other nomadic groups and the web of movements in their history. As nomadic societies in the past, they survived by adapting to nature and in turn submitting to and resisting the imperatives of sedentary populations in whose proximity they lived. Bunny pastoralists in particular received a huge setback when pastures common to both Sindh and Kutch became inaccessible. Simultaneously, the desert salinity made the topography inhospitable for their cattle. As cattle breeding got reduced to cattle grazing and mere subsistence, women's embroidery emerged in the period after the 1970s as one of the sources of livelihood. From personal and domestic consumption, it was adapted to needs of a commodifying culture. If embroidery responded to historic shifts, it was also a historical text by itself. Its threads, motifs, colors, designs, and relationship with women's bodies deepens our knowledge of money, and especially its women, who reinvent traditions by their relationship with it. In the period after partition, the people of Bunny lost access not only to grazing lands, but also certain textiles they had traditionally used for embroidery. The increasing use of machine woven cloth, dyed with chemical dyes, replaced the silk pat of Sindh. Michel Hardy notes how the Mutwas, arguably the finest embroiders, adapted their designs to new waves of migration into Kutch, as well as censorship of old movements. The influx of the Soda Rajputs, who after the Indo-Pak War of 1979, or the new shift from regional subcultures to transnational Islamic reforms, also found an expression in the embroidery of the region, and so on. I think I want to kind of, and then I sort of draw a whole detail on the market economy. It has invoked the speciality by which any approach to women is mediated by men. It took some time to earn the privilege of entering the women's quarters, and the privilege was granted by the men. One of the easiest things was to be able to communicate, since I shared the language the women spoke. The presence of some Kutchi in their Sindhi or some Gujarati and Persian in mine got bypassed. However, this shared context of language, usually perceived to be facilitating easy access, must not be overestimated. It also meant my being able to understand not only what women said, but also what they did say. In some of the Mutwa and Raisipota families that believe in guarding the women's terrain more steadfastly, this was a disadvantage. I would be listening to conversations among women when they would suddenly realize that I might have noticed more than they wished to share with me. So in fact, sometimes actually it was easier for white women to go into the quarter than it was for me. Because I They knew that I was picking up a lot. As a translator, the questions became particularly frequent. Did I have the freedom to translate what was not meant for me? Or do I render half-said things, sentences trailing off to avoid finality about views that they had and could not conceive? This situation brought to mind Michelle Hardy, an anthropologist who mentioned that she worked with women because it was culturally appropriate. On the other hand, I got to know Bunny through its men, who became my principal informants, friends, and also, unfortunately, gatekeepers in my meetings with women. They interpreted the women's world for me rather summarily. My desire to meet the women had to be couched in social terms. This is ironic considering that as a woman researcher, I ought to have had direct access to women. However, there were two things that worked against this. The nature of my questions about Bundy's nationhood, its relationship with the state, its internal geography and culture, and the pastoral life of its people. This did not necessitate by interacting with a particular family, but a mix of people from different communities. In the process, I suspect, I got slotted as their men folks' friend and also an Indian woman who understood their language, both verbally and non-verbally. My impression found validation when I heard Hardy mentioning in her thesis that her principal informant Khadija had told her that had she been an Indian woman, or had she wanted to go off with men all the time, she would not have allowed Hardy to stay with her for more than a few days. The first year was characterized by this impasse. However, I gradually became a woman to the women, as one who had a family and whom some people from Bani had visited. I traversed the Otak only when the women had also traversed it mentally to come into my life and seen there was a Sindhi woman here, different in class and religion, but one they had become comfortable with.